I've talked before about the manipulation of data surrounding the Wuhan coronavirus death toll. Specifically, the CDC previously issued guidance telling hospitals to mark deaths as COVID, as they like to call it, whenever it's presumed as the cause of death. In other words, no positive test needed. If the person coughed, you can just call it COVID-19 or call it the Wuhan coronavirus, and they'll count it as one of the deaths. Moreover, hospitals get extra money for Medicare patients if those patients had the virus versus any other respiratory illness. A recent update to the CDC website is beginning to kind of shed some light on just how fraudulent the death toll data really has been. And we still don't have clear numbers, and the truth is, we never will. The data has been so manipulated, but this gives us kind of like a tiny insight into what really has been happening. Alright, so the CDC says that basically only 6% of the people who supposedly died of the Wuhan coronavirus actually died of the Wuhan coronavirus. Take a look at their website where it says, quote, "For 6% of the deaths, COVID-19 was the only cause mentioned. For deaths with conditions or causes in addition to COVID-19, on average, there were 2.6 additional conditions or causes per death," unquote. Now, 6% of the current death toll is about 9,000 people in the United States. That is extremely small when you compare it to, say, the flu, which kills about 60,000 Americans in a year. Some years it's much worse, of course, but that's the average. Then there's that 2.6 other conditions. People had 3 other conditions in addition to the Wuhan coronavirus? I don't mean to sound morbid here, but we're talking about people who largely already had a foot in the grave. People who were very older, who had a lot of conditions, who would have been killed likely by the flu alone. And there were people like me, I'm just going to go ahead and say, who early on in the virus days were saying that, well, this is actually hitting a lot of elderly people only. People with lots of different conditions, it's not striking the healthy. And yet, people like me were smeared and ignored. Now, I took a look and downloaded the actual data that the CDC put out. I didn't just look at the 6%, I decided to delve in a little bit deeper and see what else we could find out. Well, tens of thousands of the deaths being attributed to the Wuhan coronavirus, as they call it COVID-19, had the flu too. If you're downloading the data yourself, you'll see it mentioned as influenza. It's the more technical or medical term for the flu. So these people had both the Wuhan coronavirus and the flu. And again, the flu kills 60,000 people most years, sometimes higher. And people in the early days of this virus were wondering if flu deaths were being miscounted as Wuhan coronavirus deaths. That didn't seem likely to me because flu deaths weren't any lower than they were normally in a given year. They seemed normal. And so that's why I never posited that as a theory. But now it looks like those deaths have been double counted. They were counted both as flu deaths and as Wuhan coronavirus deaths. Like, those people died twice. What kind of science is that? Right? I also found that over 20,000 of these deaths died of cardiac arrest or a heart attack. Now, there are 2 ways to take that. It is possible that a person could be severely sick with, say, a virus, and get to the point where their body can't fight back and they eventually die because their heart gives out, hence cardiac arrest. But it's also possible that the person simply died of a heart attack at home, and then when they tested at autopsy, the person had the Wuhan coronavirus in their system. There is no distinction made in the data between these 2 very different situations. The person had a heart attack, they just happened to have this virus in their system. They didn't die of the Wuhan coronavirus. They died of a heart attack if they died of a heart attack at home, right? That isn't the way that we would mess with the data if it were the flu. If it were the flu and a person had a heart attack whilst walking around, and we found that they had influenza in their system at autopsy, no sane person, no scientist would say, well, that person died of influenza. Of course not. It would be intentional manipulation of the data. Further, I found that 10% of the deaths that occurred in people under the age of 35, well, they were due to poisoning, trauma, and unintentional injuries. So that's where those motorcycle injuries went that we heard about. I'm not joking. People who died from motorcycle accidents were included in the CDC data as COVID-19 deaths. It's obscene and incredibly unscientific, of course. But now the fact checkers are coming out to say, well, no, it's not just 6% of the people that died of this virus. Just ignore all those people who are reading from the CDC website. These fact checkers. What's a fact checker nowadays? It's a propagandist for the Democrat Party. It's a journalist who is even more biased than the regular journalist of the mainstream media. Seriously, that's where we are at this point. Just kind of drill it into your head when you hear fact checker. It's, these extra biased, supposed journalists, because that's all they are. They're propagandists. Now, imagine this too, because this is where it gets kind of muddy, I'm going to say. If someone had the flu and also had the Wuhan coronavirus, how would you determine which one killed him? You couldn't. You couldn't, because the symptoms were the same. It was a respiratory illness. The symptoms were the same. Now, by the odds, I'd say it would probably be the flu, because it had a higher fatality rate. And we know that now. Earlier on, we may not have known that, however. But they're just double counting them as both. That's what it would seem. Now, lots of these people had heart conditions that killed them. Multiple heart conditions sometimes that killed them. And what I found is that a lot of people don't want to accept this data. They don't want to accept that it wasn't we, but they don't want to accept that these bureaucrats and politicians shut down the country for a virus that killed less than 10,000 Americans. They don't want to accept that people gave up their rights so willingly, that tyrants were able to grasp power so willingly. Part of it, I think, with the masses who are unwilling to believe it, is because people put their lives on hold. People played along. They wore the mask. They stayed alone by themselves in a house, not able to fully communicate. They didn't do the things that they normally do in their lives. They put everything on hold. Some of these people berated their friends and their families and their neighbors if those people were unwilling to comply to the same degree that they did. It would take some humility for those people to say, I was wrong, I was played, I was manipulated, I was lied to, and, simply, I was wrong. That's really hard for a lot of people to say. And then there are the people who don't want to give up their power. These are the people, the politicians and bureaucrats who made these rules, these tyrants, who have seized the opportunity to take away people's rights, to shut down businesses. In many cases, a lot of these businesses, of course, aren't going to reopen, who have led to people's suicides en masse. These politicians who don't ever want to give up that power, those emergency powers, as they're so often called, that are limitless. At least that's how it's implied now, how it's inferred. These people now think, these governors and mayors, that they can simply write a law on a piece of paper. It doesn't need to go through any sort of legislature. That they are kings or gods amongst men. And so there are a lot of people who have a vested interest in making sure that the hysteria continues. And so that's why I thought I'd throw in some actual facts from the CDC of all places. Because facts nowadays when it comes to the Wuhan coronavirus are really hard to come by. But this just proves what we've known for a long time now, that the whole thing is a sham. We've been played. Wait, if you enjoyed that video, please remember to like and share. I can't grow without you. Also, if you want to be reliably notified of new videos, don't forget to subscribe to the newsletter. If you're able to support the production of these videos, I'd appreciate it if you'd subscribe at Subscribestar, or maybe get one of the healthier products, or even get some merch.